At 85, Steve McQueen's widow finally uttered a sentence that left all of Hollywood frozen. The person Steve loved most was never a woman. She revealed that all the public romances, the glamorous beauties, and the very public affairs were nothing more than a desperate cover for a relationship Hollywood would never have allowed. She said there were nights when Steve brought an actress to a hotel just for appearance's sake, but by midnight he would disappear from the room, leaving behind on his shirt the scent of a man's cologne. She admitted that she once heard Steve drunk and half asleep calling the name of a man she had never met. From that moment, she opened the question that made audiences shiver. Who did Steve McQueen truly love? And why was his entire life a grand act of concealment? People say he had affairs with women, but the one he truly loved was never a woman. That was the sentence Steve McQueen's widow spoke when she was over 80, and it cut through every myth, every rumor that had ever surrounded Hollywood's King of Cool. She said it softly, as if she had carried it inside her. For decades, a shard of truth she had never dared to touch until time left her with nothing else to fear. People always believed Steve McQueen was an untiring woman chaser, a man who needed only a single glance to sweep any actress off her feet. But the widow looked at me for a long time as if to check whether I was steady enough to hear the rest. And then she said, all those women were masks. A fog he created to hide the most painful truth of his life. And she began to tell the story. During the years they lived together, she had witnessed everything. The tabloids wrote the nights he vanished, the strange late-night calls, the long business trips that came with new rumors every day. Steve could flirt with a co-star during filming, bring a woman home right after she left, or juggle 4 or 5 relationships across different cities at once. But she said he did all of it for one purpose, to make sure Hollywood never suspected the person he truly cared for. Hollywood at the time was unforgiving. An action star like Steve McQueen, seen as the ultimate symbol of masculinity, couldn't afford a single missed step if he wanted to keep his career alive. One wrong look, one unusual gesture, one rumor going the wrong direction, any of it could destroy him forever. So Steve chose the easiest way to distract the world, to appear hopelessly obsessed with women, and he played the role so perfectly that no one questioned it. The widow recalled a line that the media loved to repeat back then. If Steve stays in a city for more than 48 hours, oh, a woman will enter his life. Most people took it as fact. But she smiled sadly as she told it. That's exactly what he wanted them to believe. He crafted that image on purpose. She remembered one night in New York. Steve had just finished an interview and they were invited to a large party. The moment they walked into the hotel lobby, Steve deliberately leaned close to a young actress, whispering something that made her laugh just long enough for the paparazzi to capture the moment. He performed like that constantly, she said. One smile, one timed gesture, one glance, and people assumed he was having an affair. But that night, as soon as the hotel doors closed and the crowd disappeared, Steve dropped the act, let go of the woman's arm, and walked straight to the reception desk, coldly requesting 2 sectarian rooms, even though they arrived as a husband and wife. She asked why. Steve only said someone is waiting for me and that someone was not a woman. There were nights when they had to attend a Beverly Hills party. Steve always played the part, perfectly smiling on cue, holding a woman's waist at the right angle, chatting intimately with the most sought-after actresses. Everything the press captured was Steve McQueen, Hollywood's #1 woman chaser. But when they returned to the hotel, Steve always asked for 2 different keys, and she knew that each time he would disappear around 3 o'clock in the morning. Some nights he returned very late. She wasn't asleep, just lying on her side. The door opened. Steve walked in with his eyes red as if he had been crying or arguing with someone. On his collar lingered the fragrance of a cologne, not one meant for women. She whispered, "Steve." He replied only with a long, heavy sigh and sat on the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. "I can't help it," he murmured. She understood, and because she understood too well, she chose silence for decades. Then she told me about Steve's distraction network, the phrase she used to describe how he built an entire illusion of chaotic romance to hide a single truth. He grew close to Jacqueline Beatty, showed magnetic charm toward Natalie Wood, flirted with Priscilla Presley, allowed rumors with Marilyn Monroe to spread, even let whispers about Sharon Tate circulate widely enough that everyone believed they were true. And then there was my Van Doren, one of the few women bold enough to claim she had been involved with Steve. But even she admitted that in their most intimate moments, Steve seemed absent, as if his heart was somewhere far away. The widow said he had affairs with women, but he never loved them. Steve loved one person, and that person was never named. She said all the women who were ever with Steve shared the same feeling. He was both close and distant, as if half his heart wasn't theirs. Once an actress who had spent months working with Steve told the widow during a private meeting, "I know Steve likes me, but every time I think he's about to open his heart. His eyes look past me like he's looking at someone else entirely." The The widow only smiled then, but inside it felt like someone tightened a fist around her chest. Perhaps the story that haunted me most was the night she heard Steve whispering a name in his sleep. She never revealed the name, and she never intended to, but she said, Steve repeated it over and over in a low, aching voice, as if calling to someone who had gone far away. She said, at that moment, I knew for sure. I knew I wasn't the only woman in his life, but I also knew I wasn't the only one he wanted to keep. Then she sighed. The one he wanted to keep was another man. People always called Steve McQueen a charming predator, the symbol of masculinity, the man all of Hollywood admired for a magnetism no one could resist. But beneath that image, the widow said, was a heart constantly squeezed by two things: the fear of being exposed and the pain of loving someone he was never allowed to love. Steve was always acting, she said. Even when he was cheating, he was still acting. Every woman who walked into his life was just a prop, not a true scene partner. Only one person ever made him tremble, and that person never stood in the light. She paused for a long time before saying the final line. If the world knew who Steve loved, he would no longer be Steve McQueen. Steve wasn't addicted to cars. He was addicted to the feeling of not having to think about the man he loved. That was the sentence, his widow whispered, as if she had held it inside for too long. So long that even repeating it made her heart tighten. She said that for years, Hollywood called Steve McQueen an adrenaline addict, a man who lived by speed and flirted with danger, a star who treated the line between life and death like a game. But the truth she claimed was completely different. Steve wasn't addicted to adrenaline. He was addicted to emotional numbness, the only date that helped him forget the person. He was never allowed to love openly. She said there were nights when Steve quietly left the house, driving straight out onto the highway, leaving behind the roar of an engine, tearing through the night. No one knew where he went or why he had to hurl himself into the darkness, like someone trying to escape his own skin. Only she, the wife, waiting in the dark, could hear the sound of his car growing farther away, more out of control, as if he were searching for a speed fast enough to silence the screaming in his chest. He could drive 160, even 200 kills on roads that were anything but safe. What would terrify others was the only thing that made Steve feel a little less hurt. Friends tried to explain it to excuse it. He just likes the rush. He's the kind of man born to live fast. He has a reckless streak in his blood. But the widow spoke slowly, clearly, each word cutting into the air. That's not it. He was just looking for a place to hide from his feelings. Steve knew he would never be allowed to love that man. Never allowed to let the true impulse of his heart override the image Hollywood had built for him. From the moment his career exploded, Steve understood that a single moment in the wrong direction would make the whole world turn away. And because he couldn't live that love openly, he chose the only way he knew to keep going, by numbing himself. Racing was only part of it. She said their house always had a locked cabinet, not for alcohol, but for pills. Whenever anxiety hit, whenever he missed that person so much his chest twisted, Steve would open the cabinet and take anything that could make his mind float. Strong whiskey painkillers, sedatives, even things no doctor would ever prescribe. As long as he swallowed something, as long as it took effect, Steve would have a few hours without thinking, without feeling, without fighting his own heart. Those closest to him said he used anything that made his mind go blank. And the widow confirmed it. He just wanted silence, a complete silence inside his head. But the side effect of all that running was instability. Steve's moods became more erratic, harder to predict. Some days he was gentle, holding her for a long time, as if clinging to her, as if afraid he would sink the moment he let go. But there were also days when he came home like a storm. Red eyes, rough voice, breath laced with alcohol and chemicals. He slammed doors, threw his jacket onto a chair, and exploded in anger over the simplest question. If a stranger smiled at her on the street, Steve immediately grew suspicious. If a man touched her arm in a crowded party, his gaze would instantly darken. He checked her letters, listened in on phone calls, even tore apart their bedroom once because he was convinced she was hiding something. Steve was someone who'd been abandoned as a child, the widow said, and people like that are terrified of losing the ones they love, so terrified they destroy everything around them just to feel in control. But in Steve's case, that need for control was more complicated. He controlled women because he couldn't control his feelings for that man. That contradiction split his heart in two, and he had no idea how to handle it other than turning it against the people closest to him. There was one evening she remembered vividly, one of those memories she still couldn't shake. Steve came home from a heavy night of drinking, staggering into the bedroom. She moved to steady him, but he pushed her away, collapsed onto the bed, and began mumbling. At first, she thought he was calling her name, calling unconsciously like many drunk people do. But no, it wasn't her name. It wasn't any woman's name, she knew. He repeated that name over and over in a voice so full of hurt that she froze. She sat down beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, but Steve kept whispering that name, this time softer, more broken, like he was apologizing to someone. She understood instantly. She understood everything. That was the first time she said, and also the last time I ever heard the name of the man Steve loved. She never spoke that name again, not once. She said if she did, it would be the greatest betrayal of her life and of Steve's life. But she admitted that after that night, every outburst, every race, every time he drowned himself in alcohol, every time he wrecked a room, all of it started to make sense. Steve was at war with himself, punishing himself, trying to erase something that only carved itself deeper the more he tried to bury it. She said that sometimes Steve would sit alone for a long time, silent as stone. No alcohol, no pills, no speed. Just a man who looked exhausted from hiding himself for too many years. And in those rare moments, she saw his loneliness more clearly than ever. A loneliness no woman could ever feel. He always thought he was doing something wrong, she said. So he punished himself by living fast, by living on the edge, living as if there was no tomorrow. Because for Steve, loving another man was something that could never exist. I knew he would destroy me, but I still couldn't walk away. When Niall Adams said that she had already left Steve McQueen for many years, built a new life and rebuilt herself. Yet her voice still dropped, still carrying a quiet, nameless dread. Nyla was the first woman in Steve's life. Not in the spotlight, but in the years when he was just a hungry young actor, unknown, not yet full of scars, and not yet someone who knew how to love properly. In 13 years together, Nyla had been everything to Steve, friend, wife, companion, and witness to his transformation from an anonymous actor into a screen legend. But in those same 13 years, she endured things most women would never forgive. Steve could hit her, betray her, openly break her down physically and emotionally, and yet somehow she still couldn't let go. Nyla said that once, after a blazing argument, when she discovered Steve had been with a young actress, she struck back in the only way she knew would hurt him. She had an affair, not out of love for the other man, but to make Steve feel the pain he had been causing her for years. But his reaction went far beyond what she imagined. He lost control, smashed furniture, threw chairs or punched walls, and finally broke down in tears like a child. He fell apart as if I were the one who had destroyed everything. First, Nyla said, even though he was the one who had been breaking our marriage for a very long time, what haunted Nyla wasn't the violence, the jealousy, or the chaos. It was a dark, inexplicable magnetism that kept pulling her back. There were nights she packed her bags, keys in hand, ready to leave. But the moment Steve appeared in the doorway, looking at her with exhausted eyes, saying nothing, she couldn't step out. He made me believe that if I left, he would die, she said, and I believed him. That pull didn't stop with Nyla. Ali McGraw, the second woman to enter Steve's life, fell into the same spiral. Ali was a beauty icon of early 1970s Hollywood, a phenomenon after Love Story, the most sought-after actress of her time. She had everything: fame, a flourishing career, a powerful producer husband in Robert Evans, and a future brighter than most could dream of. And then she met Steve McQueen. By then, Steve's allure had reached its peak. Ali described him as a dormant volcano, never exploding too quickly, but always pulling others in with no escape. From their first meeting, she knew she was standing in front of a storm, and just as she sensed a few months later, her life was completely overturned. She divorced Evans, the man who had launched her career to be with Steve, and from that moment, door after door in her professional life slowly began to close. Not because Hollywood rejected her, but because Steve asked her to stop working. He didn't say it like an order, but with a tone so cold it was suffocating. I don't want my wife out there being surrounded by men. For a woman who had been a symbol of independence and strength, that request was a shock, but Ali agreed for Steve for his eyes. For the way he made her believe that if she continued living her own life, he would fall apart. Ali signed a prenuptial agreement, agreeing to walk away with nothing if they divorced. She stepped back from Hollywood at her peak. She lived under the same roof with a man who wouldn't allow her to look at other men, but who could be with anyone he wanted. Steve was unfaithful openly, and every time she found out, he answered with silence. No apologies, no excuse, no regret. But he never truly let her go either. What stunned people was that Ali still didn't leave him. Even under control, betrayal, and isolation, she stayed. Why? Because in the rare moments when Steve allowed himself to be vulnerable, she saw something. A wound buried deep inside him. I stayed, Ali said in an interview years later, because I felt he carried a wound. I wanted to heal. That sentence haunted everyone who heard it, A woman giving up everything, fame, independence, career, because she believed she could mend a man bent on self-destruction. But the painful truth was this: the person truly wounded was not hurting because of her, and she was never going to be the one who could heal him. Both Nyla and Allie, though they came from different generations and worlds, once believed they could be the ones to fix Steve. But in the end, they arrived at the same realization. Steve wasn't broken because of them. He was broken because of a love that never got to exist. A love that was never named. A man who never stepped into the light. Some wounds never bleed, yet slowly erode the heart. And Steve, in the eyes of the two women who loved him most, was living proof of that. If I'm not the brightest star in the frame, then I don't need that frame at all. People say Steve McQueen once said that line during a meeting with a director right in front of the entire crew, and no one dared laugh. No one dared disagree. Because to Steve, it wasn't simple pride. It was a rule of survival. A personal defense system built from a deep fear. Fear of being overshadowed, fear of being replaced, and most of all, fear of losing control. Steve's widow once said softly but hauntingly, Steve couldn't stand the idea of someone being better than him, even just a little. To the public, Steve was the perfect symbol of indifference, the cool, free-spirited man who walked as if the world belonged to him. But behind the spotlight, behind the tough characters and the confident stare, was a man constantly on guard. A man with an ego so heavy he couldn't breathe if he had to stand behind someone else. On set, Steve was known as one of the hardest actors to work with, not because he lacked professionalism, but because he wanted to control everything. Lighting, sound, dialogue, even got the exact position of every co-star. If anyone stepped closer than him in the frame, he would stop the scene. If a male co-star had a line that stood out too much, Steve would ask to rewrite the script. And if the director refused, Steve was willing to walk away entirely. Nearly every director who worked with Steve had the same comment. He knew his worth, and he didn't let anyone forget it. But sometimes that sense of worth became a thorn in the collaborative process. Once while filming an action scene in Le Mans, Steve demanded the director change the camera angle because he felt it favored the car more than his face. When the director refused and insisted he was the one in charge, Steve slapped him in front of dozens of crew members. The shoot was canceled that day and production shut down for 3 days just to calm the situation. But the peak of his ego, many said, happened during the Towering Inferno 1974, where Steve starred alongside legend Paul Newman. The film was a blockbuster featuring two of the biggest stars of the decade, but putting two giants of masculinity in the same frame came with challenges. Right after reading the script, Steve demanded the exact count of his lines versus Newman's and requested they be equal, not one more, not one less. He also insisted that the total screen time be balanced perfectly. If Newman appeared for 9 minutes and 30 seconds in one sequence, then Steve needed 9 minutes and 30 seconds in the next. And if any shot placed Newman slightly higher in the frame, the director had to compensate with a shot of Steve standing on steps or sitting in a higher position. The press called it a silent battle between two empires of manhood. But Steve's widow said there was nothing silent about it. Steve controlled, openly negotiated, openly demanded, openly all rooted in one invisible fear. If I am not the one who stands out, I disappear. His ego wasn't limited to film sets. It followed him everywhere. He never took supporting roles. If a script had two equally strong characters, he would ask to merge or remove one. If not, he walked away. During talk shows, Steve refused to sit with any rising male actor. If he had to attend events with them, he would arrive late and leave early to ensure no one else became the center of attention. Friends claimed Steve didn't like competition, but the widow corrected them. Not true. He liked competition, but only the kind he was sure he would win. The striking part is that most of these actions weren't about showing power. Steve didn't need to prove anything to others. He needed to prove it to himself. After intense filming days or heated arguments, he often returned home, closed his room, and sat alone. Some nights she found him sitting perfectly straight in front of the mirror, still in costume, not removing makeup, not speaking, just staring at himself for a long time. Maybe she said that was how he checked whether he was still the brightest star in the frame. The darkest part of his enormous ego, something very few ever saw, was the deep insecurity he carried about his true self. Steve had spent his entire life hiding his feelings, living in fear, holding on to a love he could never acknowledge. So he built an image too grand, too bright, too flawless, an armor even he could no longer escape. The widow said the more he demanded fairness on set, the more he fought for lines, the more competitive he became, the more he was hurting, because that was how he protected the biggest secret of his life. In the end, Steve McQueen's mole ego wasn't just a product of fame. It was the final shell he used to keep himself intact. A conflicted existence. Wanting real love, but fearing exposure. Wanting to shine, but fearing the light aimed directly at his heart. He didn't die from cancer. He died from despair. Those were the widow's final words when she spoke of Steve McQueen's sudden, heavily debated death. For years, articles, medical records, testimonies from friends, doctors, and producers all wrote the same cause of pleural mesothelioma. But if it were simply medical, his death wouldn't have fueled so many doubts. What haunted people was what Steve chose to do in his final days. The destructive decisions, the choices driven by fear or by guilt that had never been forgiven. The widow said Steve discovered his illness in 1979 after months of abdominal pain and exhaustion. At first, he blamed his lifestyle on alcohol substance speed, but the x-rays showed large lesions spreading in his pleura, classic signs of mesothelioma linked to asbestos exposure found in old construction materials, brake pads, and even film sets of earlier decades. Steve listened silently. He asked no questions, said nothing. He picked up the cap he had placed on the table, put it back on, and walked out of the clinic. The widow said he shed no tears, but that was the first time she saw him unable to drive. He handed her the keys and sat motionless in the passenger seat for the entire 42-minute ride home, staring out the window without a word. From that day on, Steve began racing, not against time, but against something she could never fully understand. Once she heard him mumble in his sleep, "I haven't fixed it yet, I haven't told him yet," before waking up, rushing to the liquor cabinet and drinking deeply, as if trying to drown something rising inside him. Close friends said Steve refused all chemotherapy, calling it a factory-made way of dying. Instead, he dove into alternative treatments, strict diets, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, acupuncture, yoga, meditation, high booze, vitamin infusions. But none were strong enough to stop a cancer already spreading. Then Steve heard about a doctor in Mexico, a man who claimed to treat cancer without chemotherapy with a strange reputation, no license, no US approval, but always promising the highest survival rates. Rumors of enzyme therapy of atrial injections made from apricot seeds banned by the FDA for lack of scientific basis reached Steve. And he didn't hesitate. He didn't trust American doctors anymore, the widow said. He said, "They're not curing me, they're just helping me wait to die." Despite everyone's objections, his agent, his closest friends, even her Steve, left. He traveled to a small town near Ensenada, just a few hours from the US border, to meet the doctor. The clinic had no license, located in an old two-story house with a hand-painted sign that was misspelled. But Steve walked inside as if it were the only place left that could save him. The doctor injected him with mixtures of secret formulas. No medical records, no protocols, no independent supervision. They infused liters of unapproved enzyme solutions, administered heavy sedatives, and gave him pills with unknown ingredients. Steve's condition worsened after each session. He grew thinner, coughed more, his chest tightened, his eyes darkened as if he hadn't slept in days. But he still believed completely. The widow said he trusted so deeply that he refused any attempt to bring him back to the US for monitoring. He believed that if he survived, he could make things right, she said. "I don't know what makes things right." But he often looked into the distance and whispered, "Just a few more years, just a few." When the tumor grew so large, it compressed his organs. Steve made a decision. Every American doctor opposed surgical removal. They said he wouldn't survive. They warned his body was too weak, that it was a fatal operation. But Steve insisted. He signed the papers, hired a Mexican medical team, scheduled the surgery for the next morning, and told no one except his closest friend. The surgery was performed at dawn. They removed much of his abdominal mass, attempting to scrape away the spreading tumors. Steve received blood transfusions and fluids and was taken to recovery in critical condition, and then he never woke up. 24 hours later, Steve McQueen passed away. No final conversation, no last words, no loved ones around. The widow didn't arrive in time. His friends didn't even know where he was until the news broke. When the press announced Steve McQueen died from complications following surgery for pleural mesothelioma, the public erupted in debate. They questioned who approved the surgery, why were there no records, why wasn't the doctor held accountable? An American doctor who once treated Steve said bitterly, "No one survives that surgery. No one. Steve didn't die from cancer. He died from a desperate decision. No one could stop." But for the widow, his death held another meaning. She believed Steve knew the risks. She believed he wasn't blind. She believed he chose to end things in a way no one else could control, but himself. Because maybe for Steve, continuing to live without being fully himself, without expressing love, without making amends, without speaking the name of the one he longed for, was a pain greater than death itself. and so he left quietly, decisively in one final attempt to reclaim freedom for himself, even if the price was everything. If there is a list of souls that will never truly rest, I believe Steve McQueen is on it. That was what his widow said. Not because she believed in spirits, but because Steve's life, even after his passing, remained a chain of unanswered mysteries. People said Steve McQueen was gone, but he never truly disappeared. Because after his sudden death, the rumor, like embers under ash, began to flare, spread, and cling tightly to the legacy of a star. Hollywood never fully dared to understand. One of the most haunting rumors tied to Steve was the murder of Sharon Tate, the unfortunate actress killed by Charles Manson and his cult in that tragic night of 1969. According to several accounts, Steve had been invited to the gathering at Tate's house that very night, and strangely, he had almost gone. Steve's closest friend said that afternoon he had planned to meet a woman and was already heading out, but a last-minute change, a call from a director, and a quick meeting diverted him. He didn't attend the gathering, and because of that, he survived. A few days later, when the list of close acquaintances of Sharon Tate was made public, Steve's name appeared in the investigation. Then another detail made everything even more chilling. Rumors surfaced that Steve was on Manson's next target list. There was no official evidence, no documents, no statements. But years later, a former detective said in the pocket of a Manson follower who was arrested, there was a scrap of paper with several celebrity names, and Steve McQueen's name was near the top. The widow said that after the incident, Steve became unusually quiet. He avoided crowded parties, stayed away from Hollywood Hills, and hired private security for his family, though he never explained why. She didn't know if Steve had truly been targeted, but she knew one thing he was afraid of, and that fear was very real. The Manson rumor was only one piece of the labyrinth surrounding Steve. In the final years of his life, multiple women appeared claiming to have been romantically involved with him. Some bring a child or two, saying, "This is his." One was an actress who had played a supporting role in a 1968 action film. She went to Steve's Malibu home carrying a blonde 6-year-old boy and waited outside his gate for 3 hours. When Steve appeared, she simply said, "You don't need to acknowledge him. I just want him to see his father once." Steve said nothing. He just stood there looking at the child for a long time. No DNA test, no legal dispute, no recorded support. But his widow said that night he sat alone on the porch drinking until morning without saying a word. Months later, another woman, this time a journalist from Texas, sent a letter asking for support. Inside was a black and white photo of a little girl with curly hair whose face looked uncannily like Steve's childhood pictures. But again, Steve didn't reply, didn't deny, didn't confirm, and those children, if they existed, eventually faded from public memory as if they had never been there. The widow didn't know how much of it was true, but she knew one thing clearly: Steve never said no. He didn't deny, he didn't argue. And sometimes silence makes people believe even more than words. After his death, the rumors didn't quiet down. They spread even further. Some said Steve had ties to organized crime because he once associated with underground racers in New Jersey. Some said he had been investigated by the IRS for unexplained wealth. Others insisted he secretly owned properties in Cuba, though even his lawyer couldn't confirm it. And most strikingly, there were persistent whispers that Steve had secretly married a third time late in life to someone who was not a woman. Of course, there was no evidence, no confirmation. Yet, those rumors invisibly became part of the Steve McQueen legend. People said he was a star, an action icon, a symbol of masculinity. But others said he was the saddest man in Hollywood, living behind layers of disguise, carrying countless secrets to his grave, and perhaps still unable to rest. The widow said only one thing: Steve left behind many layers of fog, and he never intended to clear them. She believed it was his choice because some secrets, if exposed, would destroy everything a person built. Steve knew that he chose to live with them and to die with them. Steve was a storm, but at the center of that storm was a heart that belonged to one man the world never knew. She said this as the evening darkened. The room's lights turned on. The wind murmured through the trees outside, and her memories seemed to sync with the passing time. For over an hour, she spoke of the man who turned her life upside down, the man she loved and feared, who felt both close and forever distant. And after all the rumors, the pain, the chaos, she chose to keep only the gentlest part. People remember Steve McQueen. He is demanding as a wild motorcyclist, as a fiery symbol of masculinity, she said. But I remember the man who quietly left $10,000 in an envelope for an orphanage without signing his name. No one knew. No reporters, no cameras, no applause. Just a man knocking on the orphanage door, handing the envelope to the manager, saying, This is from someone who grew up without getting hugged every night, then walking away. The widow said Steve did that many times in New York, Chicago, rural towns in the South, everywhere. He left a trace not with his name, but with small silent acts. He once said, "I don't need people to know. I just need those kids not to grow up like I did." With his own children, Steve was the same. He wasn't a perfect husband, but he tried to be a father. He didn't know how to teach homework, didn't know how to say "I love you" out loud. But he was always there for important moments, even canceling filming to attend an elementary school play. Once his son was bullied at school, Steve didn't call the police, didn't confront the parents. He went to the school, sat on the sidelines for hours saying nothing, just letting the boy who bullied his son see his eyes. After that day, the bullying never happened again. He wasn't gentle, she said, but he loved his children in a way only someone who was abandoned could understand. And with cinema, Steve McQueen was never lazy or arrogant. He was one of the few action stars who insisted on doing his own stunts, not to boast, but because he believed only by doing the jump, the punch, the fall itself could make the audience truly feel the character. In Bullet, the legendary Mustang chase became iconic because Steve refused a stunt double. He wanted viewers to see his real eyes behind the wheel. A crew member said he could have died doing that scene, but he'd rather risk it than fake it. She said that when filming, Steve became someone else, calmer, less angry, sometimes even gentle. Perhaps because in that imaginary world, he could finally be himself, able to cry, to love, to be vulnerable, to live a life he never could in reality. Once after an emotional scene, Steve sat alone in a corner, eyes red. A crew member asked, "You okay?" Steve just smiled faintly. "I'm fine, my character isn't." People said he lived fast, lived hard, lived like tomorrow didn't exist. But the widow said the truth was Steve lived fast because he knew tomorrow might be the day his secret was exposed, and he wasn't sure he could survive that. Across countless interviews, articles, and documentaries after his passing, no one ever agreed on one complete image of Steve McQueen. Everyone held a fragment, and every fragment carried a different shade: strong, fierce, magnetic, wild, unstable, dark. But perhaps only she, the last woman beside him, saw the still quiet center of the storm called Steve McQueen. "He was the loneliest person I ever knew," she said, "and also the person who hid it best." Then she fell silent, as if saying more would shatter something fragile she had protected all her life. Steve McQueen. The name Hollywood once revered was in the end just a man running from his own heart. After decades of being celebrated as the symbol of strength, rebellion, and coolness, the final truth the public never expected was that he lived in loneliness, in fear of being seen, and in a love he never dared to name. His widow once said Steve didn't need anyone to understand him. He just needed someone who wouldn't leave when he could no longer be Steve McQueen. And perhaps in those last moments of his life, stripped of fame, standing before an unmovable fate, Steve was no longer a movie star, no longer the king of cool, no longer the speed-driven icon or the man rumored to love the world. He was simply someone carrying a silent love, an unspoken apology, and a longing he never admitted. What do you think about the truth revealed by Steve McQueen's widow? Do you believe that behind the bright glow of a legend lay a life filled with so much pain and secrecy? Leave your thoughts below. Hit like, share if you feel this story deserves to be heard. And don't forget to subscribe to McQueen to continue exploring untold secrets behind Hollywood's lights. See you in the next video.